It was just after sunrise on April 8, 1942, when one American fighter climbed alone into a sky that was already crowded with danger. The air over New Guinea looked calm from the ground, but that calm was false. Hidden beyond the clouds were dozens of enemy aircraft, engines warm, guns loaded, pilots confident. Below them, on a rough airstrip carved from jungle mud near Port Moresby, ground crews watched a single P-40 Warhawk lift off, not knowing they were witnessing the opening moments of one of the most unbalanced air encounters of the entire Pacific War. The pilot was First Lieutenant Robert L. Scott, Jr., a quiet but sharp U.S. Army Air Forces officer flying with the 49th Fighter Group. Scott had already seen combat, but nothing prepared him for what would unfold that morning. At around 7:40 a.m., his radio crackled with a warning that came too late to change course. Japanese aircraft were inbound in massive numbers, heading straight toward Allied positions. Scott was already airborne, alone, with no wingman, no backup, and very little fuel to spare. As Scott climbed higher, the horizon began to fill with moving dots. At first, they seemed distant, almost harmless. Then the sun caught their wings. 64 Japanese planes, a mix of Mitsubishi A6M0s and Nakajima bombers, flying in layered formations, disciplined and deadly. It was not a patrol. It was a full strike package. Against them stood one American fighter, slower in climb, heavier in turn, and completely outnumbered. Most pilots, even experienced ones, would have turned away. Doctrine said survival mattered. Training said avoid hopeless fights. But Scott did not turn back. He understood something in that moment that could not be taught in manuals. If he ran, those bombers would reach Port Moresby unchallenged. Fuel dumps, airstrips, tents full of men would be torn apart. Someone had to slow them down. Even one fighter could force mistakes. Even one attack could break formation. The P-40 was not loved by its pilots early in the war. It was tough but unforgiving. It could not outturn a Zero. It could not climb as fast. But it could dive like a stone and absorb punishment. Scott pushed the throttle forward and climbed into the sun, knowing altitude was his only weapon. Sweat soaked his flight suit as he watched the Japanese formation grow larger in his gun sight. At 15,000 feet, Scott rolled his aircraft and dove straight down through the enemy formation. He did not fire at first. He waited. He passed so close that he could see the red roundels on the wings, the glass of the cockpits, the shocked faces inside. Only then did he squeeze the trigger. His .50 caliber guns tore into the lead bomber, ripping metal and fabric apart. Smoke burst from the engine and the bomber fell away, dragging chaos with it. The Japanese formation wavered. Pilots shouted warnings over their radios. Escorts broke formation to hunt the lone attacker. Scott pulled up hard, blacking. Out for a second, then levelled off and checked his mirrors. Zeros were already diving toward him. This was the moment when numbers usually won. This was when the fight ended. But Scott did something that left everyone watching from the ground stunned. Instead of turning away or climbing, he dove again, straight down, not towards safety, but deeper into danger. He used speed, not agility. The P-40 screamed as it cut through the air, faster than the Zeros could follow without tearing their wings apart. Scott passed under the enemy formation, rolled, and came back up from below, firing short, controlled bursts. Another bomber took hits. Another fell out of line. On the ground, radar operators and observers could not believe what they were seeing. One American fighter weaving through a sky filled with enemy aircraft, striking again and again, refusing to disengage. Japanese pilots began to hesitate. Their neat formation loosened. Bombers scattered to avoid collision. Escorts chased. Shadows, diving too steeply. Losing altitude, they could not regain quickly. Scott knew he could not win by shooting down 64 planes. That was never the goal. His solution was disruption, confusion, fear. He attacked from angles that made no sense, appearing where the enemy did not expect him. Each pass forced the Japanese to react, to break formation, to waste time. Time was everything. Every minute delayed meant fewer bombs on target. At around 8:05 a.m., Scott's ammunition was running low. His fuel gauge dipped toward empty. He had taken hits. The cockpit smelled of burned oil. Still, he made one final diving pass, firing until his guns clicked dry. Then, only then, did he turn away, dropping low over the jungle, using terrain to escape. Behind him, the Japanese strike no longer looked confident. Bombers had scattered. Some turned back. Others released their bombs early, missing key targets. The attack that should have crushed Port Moresby landed as a disorganized raid, far less effective than planned. On the ground, Allied troops survived a strike that should have been devastating. Scott landed with barely enough fuel to reach the strip. As his wheels touched down, ground crews ran toward the aircraft, counting holes in the fuselage, staring in disbelief. One man asked how many enemy fighters he had been flying with. Scott answered quietly, "Just me." What no one fully understood yet was that this single action would ripple far beyond that morning. It would challenge the idea that the Japanese always dominated the air early in the war. It would prove that tactics, not numbers alone, decided battles. And it would turn a lone P-40 pilot into a symbol of resistance at a time when the Allies desperately needed one. But the story did not end when Scott shut down his engine. What followed would shock his own commanders, anger some, inspire many, and quietly change how American pilots fought the war in the Pacific. The most dangerous part of this story was not the battle in the sky. It was what happened next. When Robert Scott climbed out of his P-40 that morning, April 8, 1942, he expected little more than a quick debrief and maybe a stiff lecture for engaging such overwhelming odds alone. What he did not expect was silence. The intelligence officers stared at him. The squadron commander asked him to repeat the numbers. Scott did. 64 enemy aircraft, 1 fighter, several passes. 2 bombers confirmed damaged, possibly destroyed. More important than the claims was the result. Port Moresby still stood. The airfield was damaged, but alive. Fuel dumps still burned quietly in the heat instead of exploding in fireballs. At that stage of the war, victories were measured differently. The United States was still reeling from Pearl Harbor, from the loss of the Philippines, from constant retreats across the Pacific. Every day felt like survival, not progress. Scott's flight became a quiet boost to morale, even if it was not widely publicized at first. His commanders understood something important. He had not broken rules recklessly. He had adapted to reality. Japanese air doctrine early in the war relied heavily on tight formations, mutual support, and psychological shock. When those formations stayed intact, they were deadly. Scott's attacks did not destroy the strike force, but they shattered its rhythm. Bombers arriving late, scattered and nervous, did not hit targets with the same accuracy. Pilots who expected no resistance suddenly faced an enemy who refused to behave as expected. In the days that followed, Scott was asked detailed questions. How close did he dive? When did he fire? Why did he attack from below instead of above on later passes? His answers were simple. He used what the P-40 could do best: speed in a dive, strength in structure, short bursts to conserve ammunition, no turning fights, no hero moves. Just pressure again and again, until the enemy made mistakes. This mindset slowly spread. American pilots in the Southwest Pacific began to understand that the Zero was not invincible. It was light, agile, but fragile. If forced to chase at high speed or dive too steeply, it lost its advantage. Scott's experience fed into a growing body of combat knowledge that would later be formalized into new tactics across the theatre. Scott himself did not slow down. He continued flying combat missions through 1942 and into 1943, scoring confirmed kills and surviving encounters that claimed many others. He flew escort, interception and ground attack missions, often under brutal conditions. Heat, disease, poor equipment and constant enemy pressure were part of daily life. Yet his calm, methodical style remained unchanged. Later that year, Scott was transferred and began writing about his experiences. His book, written during the war, described these early air battles in clear, honest language. He did not exaggerate. He did not turn himself into a myth. He focused on lessons. Speed matters. Discipline matters. Fear is normal. Action still matters more. Back in Japan, records from the New Guinea campaign would later show that the April 8th raid failed to meet its objectives. Bomb loads were released early. Coordination broke down. Escort fighters reported unexpected resistance. No Japanese pilot ever claimed they were stopped by a single aircraft, but the gaps in their reports told a different story. Something had gone wrong that morning. Something small but disruptive. By late 1942, the balance of air power in the Pacific was slowly shifting. New aircraft arrived, radar improved, pilots gained experience. But those early months mattered most. That was when belief was fragile, when confidence could collapse. Scott's lone fight was not a turning point in the war, but it was a reminder that the war was still winnable. What makes this story endure is not the number of planes involved. It is the decision made in seconds. One, pilot alone in the sky, facing impossible odds, choosing action over retreat, not out of recklessness, but responsibility. Scott understood that sometimes survival of many depends on the risk taken by one. Years later, veterans would talk about that morning in New Guinea with quiet respect. Not because of medals or headlines, but because it captured the reality of early World War II air combat. Confusion, fear, improvisation, courage without drama. When 64 Japanese planes attacked one P-40, the expected outcome was simple. The American would disappear. Instead, the attacker became the disruptor. The lone fighter became a problem the enemy could not ignore. And in war, problems create hesitation. Hesitation creates mistakes. And mistakes save lives. That was Robert Scott's solution. Not a miracle, not luck. Just understanding his machine, his enemy, and the moment. And sometimes that is enough to change everything.